One thing I will say that listeners might be surprised at is that no 18th century Italian musician was ever allowed near a keyboard until they'd done at least 3 years of solfeggio. And so partimento was not a basic study. It was for a select chosen few who were deemed good enough or suitable to learn the keyboard. And it was a completely different system because it has different functions. It has a different purpose, playing the keyboard. So the first 3 or more, literally a minimum of 3 years, they would spend doing solfeggio. And then they would say, well, you're going to be a singer, or you're going to play the keyboard, or you're going to be a composer. And that's when they would specialize. But the solfeggio training was the basic training, and it's the one that's never been written about before. Another thing I want to get clear from the start is that solfeggio is nothing like any modern solfeggio. So any listeners who are thinking, well, I know about Kodai method or movable do or fixed do or whatever, it's nothing like those. It's not the same as those at all. It's called the same, but it's not the same. That's the first thing to mention. We don't have a treatise because it was a craft secret. This was a secret method that was taught orally by maestro to student. And in fact, the Germans used to complain about this quite a lot. They used to say they were excluded from this art, and get quite sore about it. So we don't have a treatise. But what we do have, we have lots and lots of sources which tell us which syllables to use. So the solmization method is pretty clear. That's incontestable, really, the amount of sources we have. The secrets of how these things were actually sung, that's very difficult. The secret to the solfeggio tradition is knowing that music education in the 18th century was primarily geared towards churches. And this is something we tend to forget because we focus on theatres and glamorous courts and this kind of thing. But actually, the number of all the schools were church schools. If your daddy wasn't a Kapellmeister and your family weren't musicians, then you learned in church schools. That was what happened. And church schools, of course, had one main objective, which was to produce choir boys and girls and produce cantors and people for church music. So the very first thing they learned was plain chant. And this is something that's been totally forgotten. But all of the primers, all the sort of basic rules and guides and primers for kids to learn music are plain chant manuals. And they're written in a 13th century medieval notation, that they have 4-line staves and staffs, and they have square note heads. And this was totally current in Italy right up through the 19th century. If you go to church schools where Puccini was learning, they still had medieval notation and plain chant, and that's what you learned to do your church music. The thing is, they used the old medieval hexachords, and they absolutely used these. There's no doubt about that, right the way through the 18th century. Now, here I'm gonna, I'm hopefully going to stagger you with a few little facts here.
I'm already staggered.
Here's the first one. Ready?
All right.
What happened is, when I started studying the sources, I realized that the textbook or treatise was actually the plain chant manuals. I had to learn those before I could understand what was going on. So I did. I trained myself as a puer cantor, a choir boy, an 18th century choir boy, and I sang through all these plain chant manuals. And I realized something, which I've since proven, and I've discussed it and shown it to many other musicians. In the 18th century, musicians could read 84 combinations of key signatures and clefs with just 2 patterns. 2 patterns. So, nowadays in solfeggio, you have to learn your alto clef and your tenor clef.
That's right,
and
the 7 clefs.
It's just impossible. I mean, imagine a baritone clef in B major, and then it suddenly shifts to a tenor clef in, A flat major. It's almost impossible for us nowadays to do this. For an 18th century musician, there were only 2 patterns on the stave. Only 2. You only learn 2 patterns, like we would learn, for instance, treble and bass. And you could read all 84 combinations with just those 2 patterns.
Wait a second. So hold on a second. What do you mean by 84? Because I just think of 7
times 12. So 7 clefs, 12 key signatures.
Oh, okay.
So any clef, right. Any key signature. So any clef, any key signature could be read with just one of 2 patterns. It's astonishing. It's the most incredible system. The way to know this is to do plain chant.
Now, hexachord means 6 notes. How did we suddenly have 7 notes with C or T?
That's a really long question. That's a really long question. I mean, there has always been an octave in music. So, in the letter names, in the modes, there's been 7-note scales in music history going way back into the medieval period. But the partimento 7-note scale, the one that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 in the bass, is very, very recent. And in fact, the earliest mentions we have are around about 1715, and we don't really have mentions of it before then. It probably was around in the 17th century as an octave scale in the bass, but it's very strongly connected to keyboard music and learning to play chords from bass notes. In solfeggio, they use 6-syllable hexachords. And for those listeners who are not familiar with this, it's very simple. It's the first 6 notes of a scale. So it's do, re, mi, fa, sol, la. It just doesn't have the 7 notes. And the reason for that, people think, well, why bother with something so complex? It's because if you have your scale made up of 2 6-note scales instead of 1 7-note scale, in other words, your scale outlines a tenth from the tonic to the third, or the 10th above, then the letter names remain the same in any part of the scale. So if I say do, re, mi, I can also go do, re, mi in a different part of the scale, and the letters stay the same. So once you've learned one pattern, it never has to change. Think, for instance, if I use modern scale degree numbers and I sing 6, 5, 4, 3, I then have to sing 3, 2, 1, 7, which makes no sense. In the 18th century, it was la, sol, fa, mi, la, sol, fa, mi. They both had the interval pattern had the same letters, syllables. So it's a wonderful system of learning. For one thing, the teaching of counterpoint through singing has a very long history. And in fact, anyone can look me up on this and catch me out. But right into the 19th century, professors of counterpoint at music conservatoires were also professors of singing. The two were the same subject, right up until the end of the 19th century. And that's something which surprises us, because singing teachers nowadays, you don't expect them to be teaching counterpoint for some reason. But counterpoint and singing were always completely tied together in the Italian traditions. The reason for that is, of course, that you can memorize syllable names much easier than any other way. So if I tell you that fa, mi, fa can go against the do, re, mi, you'll remember that. And that's a very simple bit of invertible counterpoint. So I can have do, re, mi, and against it I said fa, mi, fa, and that makes a nice little bit of counterpoint. And there are, of course, much more complex combinations. So the syllables were instrumental in learning how to combine melodies. But I haven't got to the really main point yet as to how these things taught composition. So let me know if you want me to tell you about that.
Oh, please. No, go ahead.
Okay, so the crucial thing about a solfeggio is how you sing it. Now, in the early stages of training, you would basically sing a solfeggio, which was note-for-note syllables. So like a plain chant, in other words. So if you can think of a very simple plain chant like do, re, mi, re, do, that's a simple, melody, isn't it? Note for note. Now, they were only ever sung like that, if ever, in the very first days of lessons. So students very quickly stopped doing that. They would read the syllables without singing them for quite some time to learn to score read. But when they started singing the syllables, you sang musically or with graces. So you would never sing do, re, mi, because that's not music. You would do something to it. So you might, for instance, phrase it differently. And this was called fraseggio puro, or pure phrasing. So I might, for instance, sing do, re, mi. Or I could do something like do, re, mi. Maybe something like that, or do, re, mi, or do, re, mi, fa. So you start to phrase things in musical ways. So the first thing you do is you learn to phrase the syllables in patterns. So if I sing, for instance, la, sol, fa, mi, that's a really boring phrase. If I did something like this, sol, la, sol, fa, mi, can you see I've already turned it into music, but it's the same pattern. So you learn lots of patterns like that, first of all. Then it gets interesting, because then you learn what are called leaps, and the leaps are intervals. So I can, for instance, put a leap of the third on everything, do, re, mi, or I can do do, re, mi. And you can put different leaps on the syllables. You can put appoggiaturas, for instance, do, re, mi. Those are chromatic appoggiaturas. I can do cerca della nota, which is a kind of big appoggiatura. So, for instance, do, re, mi. That's a kind of cerca della nota, a search for the note. And there are thousands, literally tens of thousands of ways. So if I were to teach you how to sing do, re, mi in solfeggio, we would spend around 6 years doing nothing but that.
Wait, what is the difference between basic lettura or note reading and l'arte del canto, meaning solfeggio cantato meant with graces?
Yes, that's right. So solfeggio parlato is spoken solfeggio, and that's they used to read music from the stave and beat time with their hand. And this was basically to learn to read music, and they would speak it, so they didn't sing in pitch. They just spoke the syllables. So you would look at the stave and you would say do, re, mi, fa, sol, and then you would just beat them in pitch. So you were absolutely able to read any staff, any kind of music. And they used to do this before the voice broke, because they didn't like training voices before they broke. And so these poor kids, until they were sort of 11 or something, would have to just speak syllables. It must have been incredibly boring. As soon as you start to sing them, solfeggio cantato, that's a different thing. Solfeggio cantato is when you sing the syllables, and you would never sing a plain syllable. Anyone who knows anything about singing treaties know that you sing with graces, you sing with ornaments, with accent, and that's what it meant. So you don't sing do, re, mi. You sing something else. You sing do, re, mi. You sing something that's musical in a certain style. And these were taught by the maestro. So the maestro would literally speak the syllables in certain styles, and the student would copy. So it's an oral tradition.